It was late November of 1999, and a 7-foot man stood at the center of one of the most stunning headlines the National Basketball Association had ever produced. His name was Stanley Roberts, and just weeks earlier, he had walked into Philadelphia carrying a fresh contract and a quiet hope that the worst of his troubles were finally behind him. The 76ers had signed him for $725,000, a modest deal by NBA standards. But for a man who had spent years bouncing from city to city, it meant something simpler: a second chance. Then, on or around November 24th and 25th, it all came crashing down. According to reporting from outlets like The Washington Post and CBS News, Roberts tested positive for what the league described as an amphetamine-based designer substance. And just like that, he became the first player ever expelled under the NBA's new, tougher policy. Not suspended, not fined, expelled, gone. Think about that for a moment. Here was a man once whispered about as a giant who could go toe-to-toe with a young Shaquille O'Neal, a player some swore could school Shaq in practice. And now his name was attached to a footnote no athlete ever wants. How does that happen? How does a body built for greatness, a talent scouts dreamed about for years, end up defeated by battles no measuring tape and no scouting report could ever capture? That is the question we are here to answer. Because this is not just a story about a failed substance test. It is the story of a slow, painful collapse, from prodigy to warning, from can't miss to cautionary tale. But to understand how the giant fell, we have to go back to a small South Carolina town where a boy was already taller than his teachers. Stanley Corvette Roberts came into the world on February 7th, 1970, in Hopkins, South Carolina, a quiet, unhurried place where everybody tends to know everybody. From early on, it was clear this child was different, and not just a little. He kept growing and growing until that 7-foot frame became the single most defining label of his entire life. In the world of basketball, height like that is currency. A man who reaches 7 feet doesn't have to earn attention. The attention comes looking for him. Coaches see a body like that and they start dreaming, mapping out futures, imagining dominance. But Stanley had more than height. He had natural power, real strength built into those broad shoulders, and something far rarer for a man that size. He had soft hands, the kind of touch around the rim that you simply cannot teach. Most big men move like they're fighting their own bodies. Stanley moved like the game came easy to him. And right there is where the trouble starts, even before a single championship banner or scholarship offer. When a young person is gifted that much, that early, the expectations arrive long before the wisdom to carry them does. Every adult in the room starts seeing the finished product instead of the kid still figuring out who he is. That physical talent, the very thing that would open every door, would also become a target. A weight of impossible expectation strapped to his back before he was old enough to understand it. It is a familiar trap for the early bloomer, and Stanley walked right into it. By the time he reached high school, the whole state of South Carolina would learn his name, and the championships would start piling up. At Lower Richland High School, Stanley Roberts didn't just play basketball, he dominated it. He led that program to 2 straight state championships, the kind of run that turns a local kid into a regional legend almost overnight. When you win once, people call it talent. When you win back-to-back, people start calling you the future. And the recognition didn't stop at the state line. Roberts was named a parade first-team All-American, placing him among the most celebrated high school players in the entire country. By many accounts, he was ranked among the top 5 prospects in the nation. Top 5. Out of every teenager lacing up sneakers across America, scouts and recruiters had Stanley Roberts circled near the very top of the list. Now, sit with what that does to a young man. At an age when most kids are worried about a driver's license and a Saturday night, Stanley was already being treated like a finished masterpiece, a sure thing, a can't miss. That phrase, can't miss, sounds like a compliment, but it's also a cage. It tells the world that anything less than greatness is failure. It removes the room to grow, to stumble, to simply be a young person learning his craft. The seeds of the pressure that would shadow his entire career were planted right here, in those championship seasons and those glowing national rankings. He was being built up so high that there was nowhere to go but down if the climb ever faltered. Every major college program in the country wanted him, but the school he chose would hand him a roadblock before he ever played a single minute. When the dust settled on his recruitment, Stanley Roberts chose Louisiana State University, a powerhouse program, a major stage, and exactly the kind of place where a top 5 prospect was supposed to shine. The expectation was simple: show up, suit up, and start building toward the NBA. But basketball wasn't the first hurdle waiting for him in Baton Rouge. The classroom was. Roberts arrived at LSU only to learn he was academically ineligible to play his freshman year. Just like that, the celebrated recruit, the can't-miss giant, was forced to sit. No games, no spotlight. A full year of his momentum frozen before it ever truly started. For a young athlete, that kind of lost season cuts deeper than people realize. The rhythm of competition, the daily structure of being on the court, the feeling of progress, all of it stalls. You watch from the sidelines while the clock keeps ticking, and the gap between expectation and reality starts to widen. And here is where we have to be honest about a pattern that would echo through the years ahead. The discipline, the structure, the off-court habits. These were the quiet battles that would follow Stanley far longer than any opponent. The academic wall at LSU was the first public sign that raw talent alone wasn't going to carry him. The world had measured his height and his hands, but the things that would ultimately decide his fate were harder to see and harder to fix. Still, when he finally stepped onto the court, he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was another giant named Shaquille O'Neal. When Stanley Roberts finally got his chance to play at LSU, he stepped into a front court that bordered on the unfair. 2 other giants, Shaquille O'Neal and Will Milton, were already up on the roster. Beside him stood a young Shaquille O'Neal, a name that would soon belong to one of the most dominant forces the game has ever known. 2 giants, side by side, in the same college program, in the same single season. Because that's all it was for Roberts at LSU, 1 season of college basketball. But it was a season that would echo for decades, largely because of what people claimed they saw behind closed doors. Years later, in 2002, a Sports Illustrated feature looked back and posed a question that has followed Roberts ever since, asking why a man who, in their words, schooled his buddy Shaquille O'Neal as a 7-foot phenom at LSU could go on to become an NBA bust. Now, we have to handle that phrase with care. That language is journalistic shorthand from a magazine headline, not a confirmed quote from Roberts or from Shaq himself. So let's be fair and let's be precise. By some accounts, in practice, Stanley Roberts could hold his own against a young Shaquille O'Neal, and that alone tells you just how special his talent was. But we are not here to claim he was definitively better than the man who became a Hall of Famer. What we can say is this: the people in that gym saw something extraordinary in Stanley, something that made the comparison feel reasonable at the time. And that is exactly why his story stings the way it does. After just 1 season of college basketball, Roberts made a decision that stunned everyone. He left, and he didn't head straight to the NBA. Here's where the story takes a turn most people never see coming. A top 5 high school prospect, a player whispered about in the same breath as a future Hall of Famer, decides to leave American college basketball behind And instead of marching straight toward the NBA draft, he gets on a plane and heads to Europe. Stanley Roberts signed with Real Madrid, one of the most storied basketball clubs on the entire continent. To the average fan back home, it must have seemed strange, almost backwards. Why would a young giant with all that promise take such an unconventional road?
But understand the situation he was in. After his time at LSU was over, Roberts wasn't yet positioned the way a polished, ready-made prospect would be. Europe offered something real: professional money, professional competition, and a chance to keep playing against grown men instead of sitting idle. And he didn't just collect a paycheck and disappear. He made an impact. Roberts helped Real Madrid push all the way to the final of the Courage Cup, one of the recognized European club competitions of that era. Reaching a final like that, on foreign soil, against seasoned professionals, was no small thing for a young American adjusting to a completely different style of play. The international game was more physical in some ways, more tactical in others, and far less forgiving of a big man who couldn't keep up. So in a sense, this Spanish chapter revealed something about Stanley's instincts. He was willing to take the path less traveled, to bet on himself in unfamiliar territory. It showed flashes of the talent everyone had been talking about, but it also planted a quiet question that would never fully go away. Was this a young man chasing the best opportunity, or a young man already drifting away from the straight, disciplined line that turns prospects into stars? Either way, when draft night arrived in 1991, an NBA team was willing to bet a first-round pick on the giant who'd taken the long way around. The 1991 NBA draft arrived, and despite the detour through Spain, despite the academic stumble, despite all the question marks, the talent was still too tempting to ignore. The Orlando Magic called Stanley Roberts' name with the 23rd overall pick, a first-round selection. Think about what that meant. Even after everything, the lost freshman year, the single college season, the unusual jump to Europe, an NBA franchise still looked at this 7-foot frame and those soft hands and decided he was worth a first-round investment. That's how powerful raw physical talent is in this league. It buys a man chance after chance, long after the warning signs start flashing. And there's a layer of irony here that history would only sharpen with time. The Orlando Magic, the very franchise that drafted Roberts, would within a single year become the launching pad for Shaquille O'Neal's rise to superstardom. In 1992, the Magic landed Shaq, and the rest became basketball legend. So picture the strange symmetry. The two giants who once shared a front court at LSU were now connected through the same organization. Except one of them was about to become the face of the league, and the other was about to begin a journey that would scatter him across team after team. Two players, one comparison, two wildly different roads. For Roberts, being drafted in the first round should have been the beginning of a long, productive career in Orlando. The Magic were a young franchise building towards something, and a skilled big man fit the blueprint. But the truth is, Roberts wouldn't stay long in Orlando, and his next stop would produce the best basketball of his entire career. Stanley Roberts soon found himself with the Los Angeles Clippers, and for a moment, it looked like all those years of expectation might finally pay off. This was the opportunity, a real role, real minutes, a real chance to show that the giant scouts had dreamed about was more than just a tantalizing what-if. And early on, he delivered enough to make people believe again. Roberts was named to the NBA All-Rookie Second Team in 1992, official recognition league-wide that the talent was no myth. That honor matters. It isn't handed out for potential or for highlight reels. It's earned on the floor against grown professionals night after night. For a man who had taken such a winding road to get there, earning a spot on an all-rookie team was proof that the foundation was real. The prophecy that had followed him since high school suddenly didn't feel so far-fetched.
Here was a 7-footer who could score around the basket, protect the rim, and hold his ground against the bruising big men of that era. Coaches could see the outline of something special, and so could the fans who watched him develop. For the first time since those championship nights back in South Carolina, the story seemed to be bending toward the happy ending everyone had predicted. The pieces were lining up, the talent was showing, the recognition was coming. And in Los Angeles, with a fresh start and a clear opportunity in front of him, Stanley Roberts looked like a young man finally stepping into the future that had been promised to him for so long. The next season, 1992 and 93, the Giant finally delivered the kind of numbers scouts had dreamed about. And then everything began to slip. The 1992 and 93 season was the moment Stanley Roberts became, for one shining stretch, exactly the player everyone had imagined. Look at the numbers, because they tell the story plainly. 77 games played, 11.3 points per game, 6.2 rebounds per game, and 141 blocked shots. Let's break down what that line really means, because it's easy to glance past statistics without feeling their weight. 77 games, that's availability, durability, a big man showing up night after night through a long, grinding NBA season. For a player whose conditioning would later become a constant question, this was the version of Roberts who answered the bell. 11 points and 6 rebounds a night is genuine starter-level production for a young center, the kind of two-way contribution that anchors a front court. And those 141 blocks, that's rim protection. That's intimidation. That's a 7-footer changing shots and altering the way opponents attack the paint. Put it all together and you see it. The flash of the dominant force he was always supposed to become. This was the prophecy made real, if only for a season. But here's the part that makes this chapter ache. Roberts was only in his early 20s when he reached this summit. In the natural arc of a basketball life, a big man in his early 20s is supposed to be climbing, not peaking. The best years are meant to stretch out ahead of him. Refinement, mastery, the prime that turns good players into great ones. Instead, this single season would stand as the high point of everything Stanley Roberts ever did in the NBA. Not a stepping stone, not a preview, the peak. And that's the cruelty hiding inside those numbers. We look back at 77 games and 141 blocks, and we don't just see production. We see a ceiling reached far too soon. A window that should have stayed open for a decade, slamming shut while the man was still young. That 77-game season would stand as a cool high watermark, because the next year, his body began to betray him. There's an old saying in basketball that the hardest opponent a big man ever faces is the one staring back at him in the mirror. For Stanley Roberts, that opponent had a name, and it followed him from city to city, from season to season, never once losing interest. The weight, the conditioning, the constant grinding battle to keep that massive frame in fighting shape. Now, understand something about a body built like his. Carrying 7 feet of height is already a burden on the knees, the ankles, the back, the tendons. Add even a handful of extra pounds, and the strain multiplies. Every step, every jump, every landing sends a little more shock through joints that are already under enormous pressure. So when conditioning slips, it isn't just about looking out of shape on the floor. It's about the slow erosion of the very things that made him special in the first place. The explosiveness fades. That quick second leap for the rebound comes a beat slower. The lateral movement that let him guard the paint starts to lag. And here's the cruel part. The same talent that bought him chance after chance couldn't protect him from this. You can't coach your way out of conditioning problems, and you certainly can't talk your way out of them. Coaches notice. Front offices notice. Trust begins to crack. When a team invests minutes and money in a player, they need to know he'll answer the bell, ready to compete. A big man fighting his own weight becomes a question mark instead of a cornerstone. And in a league this competitive, question marks get replaced. Think back to that peak season, 77 games of durability, of showing up, of production. That was the version of Roberts who had his body under control, at least for a stretch. The contrast tells you everything. When he was right, he was a force. When the conditioning slipped, the whole foundation wobbled. And there's a psychological weight here too, heavier than any number on a scale. Imagine being a young man who was told since high school that greatness was your destiny, then watching your own body undercut that promise night after night. The public scrutiny only sharpened the pain.
Sports writers wrote about it. Fans whispered about it. The narrative hardened around him. The gifted giant who just couldn't keep it together. But wait was only the opening battle. Because in 1993 and 94, a far more devastating enemy struck, one tendon at a time. If conditioning was a slow, nagging war, what came next was a sudden, brutal ambush. The kind of blow that can end a career in a single, violent instant. The season after his peak, 1993 and 94, Stanley Roberts managed to play just 14 games. 14! After a campaign where he had suited up 77 times, his presence on the floor nearly vanished overnight. And the culprit was one of the most feared injuries in all of professional sports, the Achilles tendon. For those who don't know, the Achilles is the thick cord connecting the calf muscle to the heel, and it carries an almost impossible load for a man of Roberts' size. When it ruptures, it doesn't just hurt, it robs an athlete of the explosive push-off that every jump, every sprint, every defensive slide depends on. For a 7-footer, the Achilles is doing heroic work just to move that frame around the court. Tear it, and the foundation of everything collapses. But here is where Stanley's story crosses into something almost unbelievable, something that feels less like bad luck and more like a curse. Because it wasn't one Achilles. It was both. In consecutive seasons, he suffered Achilles tendon injuries in each leg, one leg, then the other. And the toll was staggering. He missed the entire 1994 and 95 season. Gone. A full year erased from his prime, sitting on the sidelines, watching the league move on without him. Let that sink in. Most athletes who suffer a single ruptured Achilles never return to the player they were. The injury is that devastating, that difficult to come back from. Some never play again at all. And Stanley Roberts tore both, back to back, at a moment when he should have been entering the strongest stretch of his career. The medical devastation is obvious. But consider the psychological cost. You fight your way back from the first injury. You rehab, you grind. You start to believe you can reclaim what was slipping away. And then the other leg goes. Imagine the despair of that. Imagine lying in recovery a second time, knowing the long, painful road you just traveled now has to be traveled all over again, with even less left in the tank. For a man already battling his weight, already fighting to prove the doubters wrong, this was a mountain piled on top of a mountain. Most players never recover from one ruptured Achilles. Roberts had torn both. And yet, astonishingly, he wasn't finished. Here's the thing about Stanley Roberts that often gets buried beneath the disappointment and the cautionary tales. The man was stubborn. He was tough. And after losing the better part of 2 seasons to injuries that would have quietly ended most careers, he did something genuinely remarkable. He came back. After that lost season on the shelf, Roberts fought his way back onto an NBA floor. Think about what that required. 2 damaged Achilles tendons, a long layoff that stripped him of rhythm and conditioning, a body that had already been at war with its own weight before the injuries ever struck. The smart money said he was done, that the giant who once flashed all rookie promise was finished as a real contributor. But Roberts wasn't ready to hear it. He returned to the Los Angeles Clippers, the franchise where he'd produced the best basketball of his life, and he kept battling. And from there, his journey carried him to a new home, the Minnesota Timberwolves, a young and hungry franchise still searching for its identity. Just getting back into an NBA uniform after everything he'd endured was a victory in itself, a testament to a competitive fire that the injuries and the conditioning struggles had never fully extinguished. But let's be honest about what this comeback really was. It wasn't a return to stardom. The version of Roberts who took the floor in these years was not the same player who had once been whispered about alongside a future Hall of Famer. The explosiveness that two healthy Achilles tendons once provided was diminished. The window for true greatness had closed back when his body first betrayed him. What remained was a determined professional, hanging on, contributing where he could, refusing to walk away from the game that had defined his entire life. There's a quiet dignity in that, even as the larger dream faded. He was no longer the future. He was a veteran, fighting to stay relevant, moving from roster to roster, taking whatever role a team would offer. That kind of grit kept him employed in the toughest basketball league on earth long after the prophecy had crumbled. But the journeyman years were closing in, and a 6-game stop in Houston signaled just how fragile his place in the league had become. By this stage of his career, Stanley Roberts had become something the basketball world sees far too often: the journeyman, the player who lands somewhere, then moves again. The big body teams take a flyer on, hoping to catch a glimpse of the talent that scouts once raved about, only to move on when that glimpse never fully arrives. And nothing captured how fragile his standing had become quite like his time with the Houston Rockets. 6 games. That was it. 6 games in a Rockets uniform before the road bent again. When a 7-footer who once posted 11 points and 6 rebounds a night is reduced to a 6-game cameo, you don't need a stat sheet to read the story. You can feel it. The league had stopped seeing him as a building block and started seeing him as a short-term gamble, a depth piece, a name to fill out a roster and maybe, just maybe, recapture a little of that old magic. From the Clippers to the Timberwolves to that brief flash in Houston, the pattern was unmistakable. Stanley Roberts kept landing on rosters, but he never again found the level that had been promised to him since those championship nights back in South Carolina. The giant who was supposed to dominate had become a man chasing his own shadow, moving from city to city in search of a fit that never quite materialized. And think about the emotional toll of that. There's a particular kind of pain reserved for the player who was supposed to be great. It's one thing to be a journeyman who was always considered a role player. That man can make peace with his place. But Roberts carried a heavier burden. Everywhere he went, he carried the ghost of his own potential, the constant comparison to what he was supposed to become. Every locker room knew the story. Every coach remembered the hype. He was the guy who could school a future superstar in practice, now grateful for 6 games and a spot at the end of the bench. That gap between the prophecy and the reality is a weight no scale could ever measure, and Roberts carried it from team to team as the dream quietly faded. Then, in October of 1999, a familiar face from his past offered him one last lifeline and a chance at redemption in Philadelphia. In October of 1999, when most of the basketball world had quietly stopped expecting anything from Stanley Roberts, one man hadn't forgotten him. That man was Larry Brown, the head coach of the Philadelphia 76ers, and crucially, a coach who had worked with Roberts before, back during his time in Los Angeles. Brown knew this player. He'd seen the body up close, watched the soft hands, understood what that frame could still offer a team that needed size and rim protection. And so, rather than letting Roberts fade away into basketball memory, Brown personally reached out and brought him to Philadelphia. Think about what that meant to a man who had spent years being passed around the league like a question nobody wanted to answer. When a respected coach, a future Hall of Famer in his own right, picks up the phone and says, "I still believe you can help us," that lands differently. It isn't just a contract,
It's validation. It's someone with credibility staking a little of his own reputation on the idea that there was still something left in the tank. Roberts signed with the 76ers for a modest sum by NBA standards, the kind of deal that says, prove it, but also says, we want you here. And for a moment, you can imagine the relief that must have washed over him. A familiar coach, a respected franchise, a fresh city far from the disappointments that had piled up everywhere else.
This was the setup every redemption story dreams of. The veteran given one final chance by the one man who never stopped believing. The narrative practically wrote itself. The troubled giant, his body battered, his name weighed down by years of unmet expectations, arriving in Philadelphia to quietly rebuild what was left of his career under a coach who trusted him. It should have been the beginning of the comeback chapter people would remember warmly. But within weeks of signing, a single substance test would detonate everything and make Stanley Roberts a name in NBA history for all the wrong reasons. The fresh start in Philadelphia lasted barely a heartbeat. Around the 24th and 25th of November, 1999, just weeks after that hopeful signing, the National Basketball Association announced that Stanley Roberts had tested positive for a banned substance. The league described it as an amphetamine-based designer compound, and the consequence was severe, immediate, and historic. Roberts wasn't suspended. He wasn't fined. He was expelled from the league entirely. Now, here's a detail that makes the story even more striking. Roberts didn't simply accept the result. He requested a retest, a second chance to clear his name and prove the first result wrong. But when that retest came back, it failed too. The second sample confirmed the first. There was no clerical error to point to, no lab mix-up to blame, no easy explanation that would let him walk away clean. The science had spoken twice, and twice it said the same thing. And so Stanley Roberts earned a distinction no athlete would ever want attached to his name. He became the first player expelled under the league's tougher new substance policy, the very first to fall under a stricter set of rules the NBA had recently put in place. Of all the players in the entire league, all the names that came and went, it was Roberts who became the test case, the cautionary headline, the man whose expulsion would be cited every time the new policy was discussed. The cruelty of the timing is almost too much to absorb. Just weeks earlier, he'd been welcomed to Philadelphia by a coach who believed in him. The redemption story was barely a few chapters old, and in a single announcement, all of it collapsed. The contract, the fresh start, the trust Larry Brown had extended, the quiet hope that the worst was finally behind him. Everything he'd fought to rebuild after 2 ruptured Achilles tendons and years of doubt was wiped out in a matter of days. A man who had spent his whole life carrying the weight of impossible expectations now carried something heavier still, the label of the league's first expulsion under a brand new standard. As the headlines exploded, Roberts went public with a denial that only deepened the mystery. When a man's career ends in disgrace, the natural question is always the same. What did he have to say for himself? Stanley Roberts didn't go quiet. He went public. Speaking to a Houston television station, Roberts denied knowingly taking the banned substance, insisting he had no idea how it had entered his system. Not a confession, not an apology, a flat, public denial from a man whose career had just been detonated. And here is where the story splits into competing interpretations, none of which can be proven with certainty all these years later. One reading is sympathetic, that Roberts may have unknowingly ingested something through a contaminated supplement, a real hazard in an era when athletes routinely took products that weren't tightly regulated and didn't always list every ingredient honestly. Another reading is more skeptical, that the denial was a deflection, the kind of thing a cornered athlete says when the truth is too costly to admit. The honest answer is that public accounts differ, and we are not in a position to declare which version is the truth. What we can do is set the scene fairly.
This was the dawn of what people called the era of designer compounds, substances deliberately engineered to slip past the testing methods of the time. The science of detection and the science of evasion were locked in a constant race, and players didn't always understand exactly what they were putting into their bodies. Trainers, suppliers, and so-called performance products operated in murky territory, and an athlete could genuinely lose track of what was legitimate and what would trigger a positive result. That uncertainty is part of what makes Roberts' case so murky, even now. Did he know? Did he not? The failed retest confirmed the substance was there, but the substance being present and the man understanding how it got there are two different questions. What's undeniable is the human picture.
A 7-footer who had already lost so much, his peak, his health, his standing in the league, now stood in front of a camera, his name attached to a scandal, trying to convince a skeptical public that he wasn't what the headline said he was. Whether you believed him or not, it was a portrait of a man at the lowest point of a long, painful descent. Expelled and humiliated, Roberts faced a 2-year wait and the question of whether the NBA would ever let him back in. To truly understand why Stanley Roberts fell so hard and so publicly, you have to understand the moment the league was in. The tougher substance provision that ended his career didn't appear out of nowhere. It came directly out of the collective bargaining agreement that followed the bitter labor lockout, a freshly negotiated set of rules between the league and its players that, among many other things, sharpened the consequences for banned substances. The policy was new, the ink was barely dry, and Roberts had the misfortune of becoming its very first casualty. There's a particular cruelty in being the first. When a league installs a tougher rule, it needs something to give that rule teeth, a real case, a real name, a real consequence the rest of the players can see. Early enforcement sends a message louder than any memo ever could. It tells every athlete in every locker room that the new standard isn't just words on paper, that the punishment is real and the league is willing to use it. And whether anyone intended it or not, Stanley Roberts became that message. Now, consider the symbolism of who that first case turned out to be. Not a superstar with a guaranteed 9-figure deal. Not a franchise centerpiece the league might hesitate to lose. It was a journeyman on a modest contract, a man near the very edge of his career, holding on by his fingertips. There's an uncomfortable truth buried in that. It's far easier to make an example out of a player the league can afford to lose than out of one it can't. Roberts had no leverage, no untouchable status, no army of fans demanding leniency. He was, in the coldest sense, the perfect test case, visible enough to make headlines, expendable enough to make the point without major cost to the league. None of that means the result was unjust. The substance was confirmed, twice. But the context matters. Roberts didn't just lose his place in the NBA. He became a symbol, a line in the history books, the answer to a trivia question no man ever wants to be. The first player expelled under a brand new standard, his fall serving the league's larger purpose of proving it meant business. For 2 long years, Roberts disappeared from the basketball world, but in early 2003, the league quietly opened the door again. Under the terms of the policy that ended his career, Stanley Roberts wasn't banished forever. He was eligible to apply for reinstatement after 2 years had passed, a built-in window, a narrow crack of light at the end of a very dark tunnel. And when those 2 years finally expired, Roberts did exactly what you'd expect from a competitor who had clawed his way back from torn tendons and lost seasons. He applied. Around January of 2003, the league granted it. After everything, the expulsion, the failed retest, the public denial, the long exile, Stanley Roberts was officially cleared to play professional basketball again. On paper, It reads like the start of a comeback. The door swings open, the prodigal giant returns, and the story finds its second wind. The Toronto Raptors signed him, giving him a roster spot and, for a brief moment, a uniform and a reason to believe the game wasn't done with him after all. But here's the hard truth, and there's no kind way to soften it. The signing was about all there was. Toronto brought him in and then waived him. And just like that, the comeback that took 2 years to even become possible was over almost before it began. Think about the cruelty hiding in that sequence. 2 years of waiting. 2 years of staying eligible, staying hopeful, staying ready for a phone call that might never come. And when the reinstatement finally arrived, it turned out to be more formality than fresh start. A technical permission to play in a league that had already moved on without him. The body that had betrayed him with 2 ruptured Achilles tendons was now years older. The conditioning battles hadn't gotten any easier with age. And the scandal still clung to his name like a shadow no comeback could outrun. Reinstatement gave Stanley Roberts the right to play. It couldn't give him back the years, the explosiveness, or the trust he'd lost. The Toronto chapter was less a revival than a quiet confirmation that the basketball part of his life had reached its end. With the game finally behind him, Roberts made a decision that surprised everyone who remembered the troubled giant. He went back to where it all started. For most of this story, Louisiana State University represents a wound. It was the place where the academic wall first stopped him cold. The place where a celebrated recruit was forced to sit out a full year before he ever played a game. LSU was where the warning signs first flickered, where the gap between talent and discipline first showed itself in public. So you can imagine the quiet power of what Roberts chose to do after his playing days ended. He went back. Stanley Roberts returned to LSU, not to play, not to chase one more glimpse of the spotlight, but to finish what he'd started so many years earlier. He went back to complete his degree. Sit with the meaning of that for a moment. The very institution tied to his first stumble became the place where he closed the loop, where he finished the academic journey that had once tripped him before it began. That's not the act of a man running from his past. That's the act of a man making peace with it. And here's where the story takes a turn almost nobody saw coming. In a later interview with Slam magazine, Roberts didn't sound like a broken man drowning in regret. He didn't sound like the cautionary tale the league still pointed to. He described himself as happy. Happy. The same player scouts had written off as one of the great busts of his era, the man whose career collapsed under injuries and conditioning, and a scandal that made history for all the wrong reasons. That man sat down years later and said he had found contentment. There's something deeply human in that, and something that cuts against everything the headlines had trained people to expect. We're conditioned to believe that a fallen athlete must be a tragic figure forever, that the man who lost the prophecy must spend the rest of his days haunted by it. But Roberts seemed to be telling a different story, one where peace wasn't found on a basketball court or in a stat line, but somewhere the game could never reach. And in that same interview, Roberts said something about money and happiness that reframes his entire story. The line landed like a quiet thunderclap. Speaking to Slam magazine, Stanley Roberts said he was even happier now than he was with $30 million. Read that again and let it work on you, because it turns the entire narrative on its head. For years, the story of Stanley Roberts had been told as a story of loss, a man who squandered a fortune of talent, who let injuries and habits and a failed test rob him of the riches and the greatness he was supposed to claim. The $30 million figure represents everything the basketball world measures success by: the earnings, the contracts, the validation that comes when a league pays a man that kind of money to play a game.
And here was Roberts, looking back at all of it, saying plainly that whatever he'd found later in life felt better than all of that combined. Now think about what that really means. It doesn't mean the money didn't matter, or that the career didn't sting. It means that somewhere along the way, Stanley Roberts discovered that the things he'd chased so desperately, the contracts, the comparisons, the constant pressure to live up to a prophecy planted in him as a teenager, were never the things that would actually fill him up. The world had spent his whole life measuring him by what he could do on a court, by his height, his hands, his blocks, his points, and in the end, the measurement that mattered most to him had nothing to do with any of it. There's a hard lesson buried in that statement for anyone willing to hear it. We look at a man like Roberts and we call him a bust, a disappointment, a what could have been. But what we don't see, is all the work we deem necessary to get there, the struggles that come with it, that sweat and tears that went into that inch he gained every summer, the workouts that kept him from getting injured, the lights on in the park all night, the championships you didn't win, the injuries that slowed you down. We never see the way those restlessnesses, those anxieties, that inner struggle shape who you are and what you learn from that journey. We tally up the millions he might have made, the all-star games he never reached, the legacy that slipped through his fingers. But that label, bust, only measures one narrow slice of a human life. It measures the basketball. It says nothing about the man who walked away, finished his degree, and found a kind of contentment that the $30 million version of himself apparently never had. The scoreboard called him a failure. Stanley Roberts, by his own account, found something the scoreboard couldn't see. So when we tally the final numbers, the points, the rebounds, the lost seasons, what does the ledger of Stanley Roberts really say? Let's look at the full accounting, because the numbers deserve to be spoken plainly. Across 300 games in the National Basketball Association, Stanley Roberts scored 2,555 points, an average of 8.5 a night. He pulled down 1,549 rebounds, about 5.2 per game. He blocked 385 shots, roughly 1.3 each time he took the floor. And back in 1992, before the injuries and the scandal, he earned a place on the NBA All-Rookie second team. Those are real numbers, the work of a real professional who fought through more adversity than most ever face. But here's the thing about Stanley Roberts' ledger. The stat line was never really the point. Because every number on that page carries an invisible companion, the number that never got written. The points he didn't score during a full season lost to 2 ruptured Achilles tendons. The rebounds he didn't grab in the prime years that injuries erased. The blocks that vanished when his body finally stopped answering the bell. His career isn't measured only by what he did. It's haunted by what he didn't get the chance to do. And that brings us back to the comparison that has shadowed this entire story. The young teammate who once stood beside him in the same college front court. A 2002 Sports Illustrated feature framed it perfectly when it wondered how a man who, by their telling, could school his buddy Shaquille O'Neal as a 7-foot phenom at LSU could end up labeled an NBA bust. 2 giants, the same starting line, 2 destinies that could not have diverged more completely. One became a Hall of Famer, a global icon, the answer to every question about dominance in his era. The other became a warning. It's tempting to leave it there, the cautionary tale, the talent wasted, the league still citing his name when it explains how the rules tightened. And that legacy is real. Stanley Roberts will always be remembered as a hard lesson, proof that the biggest frame and the loftiest expectations guarantee nothing at all. The things that beat him weren't opponents or matchups. They were the battles no scout could measure. The body, the conditioning, the private struggles that no measuring tape ever catches. But there's a second legacy, and it's the one that gives this story its grace. Because the same man the box score called a failure went back to school, finished his degree, and told the world he was happier than he'd ever been. The giant who was supposed to be bigger than Shaq became something the box score could never measure, a survivor who walked away at peace.